Behind the scenes, Céline Dion stood motionless, her body rigid as if every muscle fiber was clenching her own life. And in that moment she realized she had been living two parallel lives for many years without anyone truly seeing. One life belonging to the spotlight, where she was strong, perfect, never missing a single note. And the other life where she was tired, afraid, and gradually losing control of her own body, she had learned to step onto the stage with a smile, even when behind it were prolonged pains, sleepless nights, mornings when she had to practice speaking, practice breathing like someone starting over from the beginning. She did not allow herself to stop, did not allow the world to see her weakness, because her voice was not just a career but her identity, the only way she knew to exist. And when her body began to rebel, she did not surrender. She trained more, endured more, tried to prolong every moment she could stand firm, because deep down, she understood that if she lost her voice, she would not only lose her job but lose her very self, and therefore, she continued to live between two worlds. One side the untouchable legend, the other side the woman silently fighting the pain no one saw, holding the image until she could hold it no longer. But it was also that very woman who built a legacy that very few artists could touch. With more than 200 million records sold worldwide, she became one of the best-selling artists of all time, winning 5 prestigious Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year and Record of the Year, winning an Oscar and a Golden Globe for the song My Heart Will Go On associated with the movie Titanic, owning a series of #1 hits, such as Because You Loved Me, The Power of Love, It's All Coming Back to Me Now, and All by Myself. She conquered the international market in both English and French, set records with long-running shows in Las Vegas bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars, received countless American Music Awards, Billboard Music Awards, World Music Awards, and was honored as one of the greatest voices in music history, a global icon whose every note carried an irreplaceable imprint. Before continuing with the story, please hit like and subscribe to the channel to send a small token of respect to Céline Dion, the woman who has silently endured more than the world has ever seen. There are children who grow up in silence even though the surroundings are always full of sounds, and Céline Dion was one of them. She was born into a family with 14 siblings, a house that was always crowded with voices, laughter, footsteps, music ringing out from impromptu singing sessions. But amid all those sounds, there was not enough space for the private emotions of a small child to be heard. Everything had to be shared, from meals, living space, to even the attention of the parents. And when a child is not clearly seen, not asked about enough, it will learn to withdraw into itself. Not because it does not want to be loved, but because it does not know how to get attention among so many others who also need it. Music in her family was not a choice, but a part of life. Her mother sang, her siblings sang, everyone sang, and her voice also soon blended into that flow. But unlike the others, she did not sing just for fun. She sang to be recognized, to be seen, to have some position in that overly crowded world. But even when music brought her the first rounds of applause, the rare attentive glances, the feelings of lack inside still did not disappear. Because what she needed was not just to be heard, but to be understood, and that was something a large family, no matter how loving, could not always provide. From very early on, she became more sensitive than other children, easily moved, easily hurt by things that adults might consider small. A passing glance, a careless word, a moment of being forgotten in the corner of the room was enough for her to feel she did not really belong there, and when those emotions repeated, she no longer reacted. She learned to stay silent, learned to keep everything inside, because speaking out would not change anything. And gradually, silence became a part of her, a protective shell that she carried throughout her life. But that shell did not make her stronger. It only made the loneliness deeper, because when no one hears you, you also begin to believe that you have nothing worth saying. In crowded meals, in family evenings gathered together, she could still smile, could still sing, could still blend into the collective, but inside there was always a void that no one touched, a feeling that she was just a part of the crowd, not the center of any story, not the person someone would look for first, and that very feeling followed her as she grew up, went with her through every stage, every song, every round of applause, because no matter how clearly the world saw her, a part of her was still the child standing in that crowded house, waiting for someone to stop, to listen, and to say that she really mattered. And perhaps that was also why, when music came, she did not just grasp it as an opportunity, but as an escape, a way to finally be heard, not among 14 people, but among millions of people. But the irony is, the more she was heard, the harder it became for her to speak her true self, because she had gotten used to keeping everything inside for so long, to the point she no longer knew how to share. And so, in a life full of sounds, she still carried a very personal, very deep, very hard-to-name silence, a silence that began from childhood, where not everyone realizes that sometimes a child does not need more music, but only needs someone to truly listen to it. Behind the scenes, one day, when the little girl's voice began to echo farther from the crowded house in Charlemagne, a man heard something that not everyone could hear, not just the notes in perfect pitch, but the longing to be seen hidden deep within each line of the song, and that man was René Angelil, who at that time was already experienced, had gone through enough successes and failures to recognize the value of something rare. He did not see a child singing, he saw a life trying to find its voice, and when her first demo recording was sent to his hands, that young but full of emotion voice made him stop, listen, and then decide to do something few dared to do. He believed in her even before the world had a chance to realize who she was. He mortgaged his own house, bet everything he had to bring that voice into the light, and for a little girl who was used to not getting enough attention, that action was not just a career opportunity, but a powerful affirmation that for the first time in her life, there was someone who truly saw her, truly believed in her, and from that moment a bond began to form, not loud, not clear from the beginning, but deep enough to change the entire trajectory of her life. At first, he was the guide, the one who opened doors she did not know existed, the one who arranged every performance, every recording, every smallest step. And she, like a child finally being held by the hand, followed without any doubt, because for her that trust was so precious it could not be questioned. When you grow up feeling forgotten, you will cling to anyone who makes you feel important. And for Céline, René did not just make her feel important, he made her feel she had value, something she had been searching for throughout her childhood. Over time, the line between work that began to blur. Conversations no longer revolved only around music, but gradually touched the voids inside her, the fears she had never spoken about, and he listened, patiently, without judgment, becoming the only person she felt she could rely on, someone who was not only managing her career, but also filling the emotional voids that the crowded family from before could not reach. And right there, the dependence began to form, very lightly, very naturally, almost impossible to notice, because it did not come from force, but from the need to connect, to be protected, be understood. And when someone is both the one who believes in you, the one who guides you, and the only one who makes you feel safe, then the boundaries of their roles gradually dissolve. He became the center of every decision, every emotion, every step in her life, from choosing songs, choosing stages, to the way she appeared in public. Everything carried his mark, and she accepted that not because she had no opinions, but because she believed he knew what was best, because from the beginning he had been the only one who saw her clearly, and when the outside world began to pay attention, when rounds of applause rang out, when her name gradually became known, then inside, something else was also growing. A life began to revolve around one single person, not by command, but by a bond so deep it could not be separated. And perhaps at that time neither of them realized that that connection, although built from trust and sacrifice, was also quietly shaping a future in which Céline Dion would not only be a voice belonging to the world, but also a heart belonging to only one person. Then came a point that even she herself could not clearly define. The relationship between Céline Dion and René Angélil was no longer just guidance or simple trust. It gradually turned into a deeper, more complex attachment, where the boundary between patron and companion began to dissolve, and affection crept in not as a choice, but as something inevitable. Because when someone appears exactly when you need them most, understands you when you do not yet understand yourself, and stays by your side long enough to become a part of your life, then giving them your affection becomes almost inevitable. For Celine, it was not a moment of explosion, but a silent process where trust turned into dependence, and dependence gradually became love. But that love was not like people usually experience. It did not begin from free choice, but from a connection that already existed, from a life trajectory that had already been shaped. And when the outside world began to notice that, the first reaction was not acceptance, but doubt, even opposition. Because the age gap between them was too large, because the way they came together was not like any other love story. And for many people, it was a relationship that was hard to understand, hard to accept. But inside, for her, everything was very clear. Because she had never known any other form of love, had never had the chance to experience other relationships to compare, had never had another path to choose. And when you only have one single choice, you will learn to believe that it is the right choice, not because you have weighed it, but because you have nothing else to rely on. Over time, the emotional dependence became more and more evident. She relied on him not only in work, but in even the smallest decisions of life. From what she wore, what she said, to the way she appeared before the world, everything went through one common point, and that point was him. This did not happen suddenly, but little by little, like the way a stream of water gradually changes the shape of a rock shore, until you no longer recognize its original shape. And in that process, she did not feel she was losing herself, because in return, she gained a sense of safety, a feeling she had lacked for so long, a feeling that there was always someone standing behind her, always someone who knew what to do when she did not know, and that very thing made her attached to him not only with love, but with necessity as well. But right there, something else began to form, a life gradually tied tightly to one single person, not by force, but by habit, by trust, by the feeling that without him, everything would no longer function as before. And when a life is built revolving around one single axis, it becomes very solid while that axis still exists, but also becomes fragile to the point of fear if that axis disappears. And perhaps at that time, when their love was kept secret for many years before being made public, when the world gradually accepted their story as a done deal, neither of them really thought about what would happen if one day that connection was broken. Because when you live long enough in a reality, you begin to believe it will last forever. And for Celine, that love was both destiny and a refuge, but it also quietly became an invisible cage, without a locked door, without holding her by force, but keeping her there by the very deep attachment to the point she could not imagine any other life, besides the one that had been predetermined since she was too young to understand everything she was stepping into. And then, when the door to the world opened, Céline Dion stepped through it not like someone looking for success, but like someone who had been pushed too far to be able to turn back. The small stages in Quebec quickly became big performances in Europe, then spread to the American market, where everything was harsher, colder, and demanded more than anywhere else. She learned English almost from zero, practiced pronunciation word by word, sentence by sentence until her voice not only conveyed emotion but also touched the hearts of a strange world. And when the songs began to climb the charts, when her name appeared on television, on radio, at award shows, the pressure also began to increase in a way no one could clearly see from the outside. Because each success was not a stopping point, but a new standard that needed to be surpassed. Each successful song became the shadow for the next song. Each big stage demanded a more perfect performance. And in that cycle, time for herself almost disappeared. Her days were no longer counted by rest hours, but by a dense schedule. Flight after flight, recording session after performance, interview after interview, and amid all that, she still had to maintain a flawless image in front of the public, a smile always ready, a voice that was not allowed to shake, a posture that was not allowed to look tired. Because the world did not come to see exhaustion, they came to see an icon. And an icon is not allowed to be weak, at least not where the lights can reach, but inside. Her body began to send signals she could not completely ignore. Periods of fatigue that lasted longer than usual, moments of losing her voice after shows, mornings waking up with a heavy feeling as if she had never slept. But stopping was not an option. Because behind each performance were hundreds of people working. Behind each contract were unbreakable commitments. And behind it all was a life built on continuing, not stopping. So she continued, singing when tired, smiling when exhausted, stepping onto the stage when her body wanted to rest, and over time, the perfection the world saw began to become a mask she could not remove. Not because she did not want to, but because she no longer knew who she would be without it. And it was precisely in those rare moments when no one was around, when the applause had faded far away, that she clearly felt the emptiness that success could not fill, because everything she achieved did not come with relief, but only brought greater pressure, heavier responsibility, higher expectations, and even though the world might see a woman standing at the peak, inside she was still a person trying to keep balance on a rope that was getting tighter and tighter, with no support, no brakes, only non-stop continuation. As if she stopped even once, everything she had built would collapse, and therefore she continued to move forward. But each step forward took away some part of her, until the very success she achieved began to become something that took away more than it gave, turning a journey that seemed like a dream into a path she was no longer sure she had chosen, or simply had gone too far to turn back. Then came a moment when the whole world seemed to stop, just to listen to Céline Dion's voice, when the melody of My Heart Will Go On rose and spread into every corner of the planet. From the packed movie theaters of Titanic to the tiny radios in distant rooms, that voice no longer belonged to her alone, but became a shared memory of millions of people. And in that moment, she did not just achieve success, she touched something very few artists had ever touched, a form of immortality that did not need to be explained, where just one note sounding was enough for the whole world to recognize, but that very immortality carried a price that no one really saw. Because when a song becomes too big, it does not just lift you up, but also holds you back, keeps you in an image you cannot easily escape. And from after that success, every time she stepped onto the stage, the audience did not just come to hear her sing. They came to hear that very song again, to relive that emotion, to see that person again. And gradually, she was no longer seen as an artist who could change, but as an icon that needed to stay the same. A voice tied to a moment the world did not want to let go. Her fame reached a level where everything around her became hard to control. Every step, every word, every choice was scrutinized, expected, predefined. And while the world saw a woman standing at an untouchable peak, inside she began to feel trapped in that very image, because she was no longer allowed to make mistakes, no longer allowed to change, no longer allowed to become another version of herself, and the pressure to maintain the expectations of millions did not come loudly. It came silently but continuously, like a flow that never stopped, making each performance no longer a simple joy, but a responsibility to fulfill, an obligation to uphold. And in those rare moments when she wondered what she wanted to sing, what she wanted to become, the answer seemed no longer as important as what the audience wanted to hear, what they wanted to see. And right there, a gap began to form between her true self and the image the world demanded. a gap she could not easily fill, because to do that, she would have to let go of what had brought her here, and that was something she could not do, not because she did not want to, but because she understood that some successes, once they reach a certain level, no longer belong to you. They belong to the memories of others, and you are only the one keeping them alive. And therefore, she continued to sing, continued to bring that voice to the world, continued to become the woman everyone expected. But deep inside, a part of her began to realize that the person she once was, the little girl who once sang to be heard, was gradually disappearing, not because she no longer existed, but because there was no longer any space for her to appear. When every space had already been filled by an unchangeable image, and the very immortality the world gave her, in a way, hers also became what kept her forever in a version she could never completely leave. Hers. And when the stage lights gradually became a familiar part of life, then behind it all, Céline Dion's life still revolved around one single point, one person whose presence almost decided everything. That was René Angelil, not just a husband, not just a manager, but the center of every choice, every emotion, every step she took. From big decisions like career direction, song selection, signing contracts, to small things like daily schedule, rest times, everything was tied to him in a way that gradually the boundary between personal life and work no longer existed. And in that relationship, love did not stand separately as an independent part. It blended into trust, dependence, necessity, to the point it was very hard to distinguish where affection was, where habit was, where the sense of safety she did not want to lose was, because when someone has been by your side from the very first days, witnessed you grow up, helped you through phases where even you did not know where you were heading, then that person is not just a part of your life, they become the very foundation you stand on. And when that foundation is too solid, you will not think about standing alone, but only about how to keep it from ever collapsing. Over time, the fear of losing him began to appear not as a passing worry, but as a silent feeling always existing behind every peaceful moment, because she understood better than anyone that if one day he was no longer there, everything would change in a way she was not sure she could face. And that fear did not need to be spoken. It showed in the way she looked at him, in the way she stayed by his side, in the way she placed him in a position no one else could replace. And that very thing made their relationship special, but also fragile. Because when love and dependence blended too deeply, you would no longer keep the necessary distance to exist independently. You would gradually lose the ability to imagine a life without that person. And for Céline, that was not a wrong choice, but the natural result of a journey that had begun when she was too young to understand everything she was stepping into. She had no other relationships to compare, no other emotional experiences to contrast. Everything she knew about love was tied to one single person, hers. And when your entire emotional world was built on one single foundation, you would not only love that person, you would need them, need their presence to feel you were still yourself. And right in that necessity, another feeling gradually formed, the feeling that if that person was missing, you would not only lose a relationship, but lose a large part of yourself. And even though on the outside she was still an icon of strength, of success, of a voice that could conquer the whole world inside, her life was still tightly tied to the breath of one man, a breath she never thought about having to live without, because for her, it was not just love, but the only way she knew to exist in a world where without him, everything might become so unfamiliar that she no longer recognized herself. And then, when Céline Dion and René Angelil's love seemed complete, another void began to appear, silently but persistently. That was the longing to become a mother, a desire that seemed natural but turned into a long journey full of challenges for her. Those years were not counted by stage lights or rounds of applause, but by silent waits, doctor's appointments, results that did not meet expectations, and the feeling of repeated failure to the point she began to doubt her own body. Each time hope, flickered was another time she had to face the truth that everything was not happening the way she wanted, and in a world where she could control almost everything, from her voice to every performance. The inability to control this became a very different pain, deeper, more private, harder to put into words. She went through complex medical treatments, interventions into her body that did not always bring results, days where physical exhaustion blended with mental pressure, when each failure was not just a result, but a blow to the belief that she could become the mother she had always wanted. And in those moments, the worry began to grow. Not worry about her career, but the worry that she might never get what her heart longed for, that her life might always lack an important part she could not replace with any success. And right in that uncertainty, she continued to try, not with the confidence she had on stage, but with the persistence of someone who did not want to give up even after many disappointments. And then, when the miracle finally came, when she had the children she had waited for so long, the joy did not come as an explosive moment, but as a profound relief, a feeling that finally everything she had endured was not meaningless. But even in that happiness, there was still a silent fear that existed. The fear of losing this precious thing, the fear that life might once again take away what she had just gained. Because when you have gone through so many failures to achieve something, you cannot fully relax when you have it. You will always carry a part of the anxiety that it might disappear. And from then on, family did not just become joy, but became the center of everything. The place she returned to after every show, the reason that made her continue stepping onto the stage, the only support that helped her keep balance in a life full of pressure, and it was also the place where she found another version of herself, not a diva, not an icon, but a mother, an ordinary woman with very real, very everyday worries, and perhaps for the first time she felt she did not need to be perfect, did not need to meet the expectations of the whole world, just needed to be there, present and loving. But even that piece was not completely whole, because deep inside, she knew that life had never been easy with her, and that made every happy moment even more fragile, as if she was holding something precious in her hands without daring to grasp it too tightly, but also unable to let it go. And then the fear that Céline Dion had always tried to keep at a safe distance began to take a clear shape when Renée Angelil fell ill, not in a passing moment, but in a prolonged journey, where each passing day carried a small sign that everything was changing in a direction she could not control. At first, it was the fatigue, the medical appointments they tried to keep private, then gradually the hospitalizations, the treatments, the longer silences between conversations, and for someone who had gotten used to relying on him as an irreplaceable pillar, witnessing him weaken was not just the pain of a wife, but the shaking of the entire foundation of her life. The days in the hospital were not marked by performance and schedules or flight times, but by the steady sound of machines, the smell of disinfectant, the cold white light shining down on endless long hallways. She sat by his bed, holding the hand that had once been strong but now became thin and weak, listening to each breath as if it was the only thing keeping her world from collapsing. There were days they talked, there were days with only silence, but even in that silence, she stayed, did not leave, because for her, being by his side was not an obligation, but the only thing she knew she had to do. And when the time in the hospital stretched longer, her life gradually shrank. No more tours, no more hours-long performances, only small rooms, hard chairs, sleepless nights, and a feeling of helplessness she had never experienced before. Because in music, she could always do something. She could change. She could touch emotions. But here, no song could save him. No note could slow down time, and that helplessness did not come as a shock but accumulated little by little, a bit each day, until it became a part of life. She learned to live with it, the way she once learned to live with silence when she was young. But this time, the silence was heavier, because it came with the fear of losing the only person who had always been there. The days at home were not much different, only the settings changed. but not the feeling. She took care of him, monitored every small change, every sign from his body, tried to do everything in her power, but deep inside, she knew that some things could not be reversed. And that awareness made every moment more precious, but also more painful, because you both wanted to hold on to it and knew it was gradually slipping away. And throughout that journey, her love did not diminish. If anything, it became even deeper, but along with that love was a constant worry, a feeling that time was shortening, that each passing day brought them closer to something she did not want to name, and the very prolongation of this process, not a sudden moment but a chain of days following one another, made the pain not explode, but spread, seep into every thought, every action, every breath, making her tired not only physically but mentally, a fatigue that could not be slept away, could not be rested away, because even when she closed her eyes, she still knew what was waiting ahead, and no matter how hard she tried to hold on, hope, a part of her, was still preparing for the worst, not because she wanted to, but because she had understood that there were battles that could not be won, only prolonged, and in that journey she did not leave, did not let go, did not turn away. She stayed, day by day, hour by hour, witnessing her love slowly change shape, from something that gave strength to something that caused her pain, but still unable to let go, because for her, loving someone was not only being by their side when everything was good, but staying when everything was gradually slipping away, even if that meant having to watch parts of her life drift away without being able to do anything to keep them. Then one day, the moment that Céline Dion had tried to postpone in her mind for many years finally happened, not loudly, not dramatically, without any explosive moment like in the movies she had once lent her voice to, just a very quiet, very cold stop. When René Angelil no longer breathed, the room stayed the same, the light stayed the same, the equipment still made its steady sounds until everything suddenly became flat and silent, and in that moment, it was not the world that stopped, but her. She stood there, not crying right away, not screaming, not collapsing, just an emptiness spreading from inside, as if her body was still there, but the most important part had disappeared without leaving a clear trace. And what made it so hard to accept was not that death came unexpectedly, but that she had known it would come, had prepared for it day by day, hour by hour. But when it actually happened, all the preparation became meaningless, because there was no way to prepare for the absence of a person who had been the center of everything. The days after that were not remembered by events, but by emptiness. The familiar house became bigger, quieter, the hallways no longer had his footsteps, the mornings no longer had anyone to ask a simple question, the evenings no longer had anyone to share the small things with, and that very silence became the hardest thing, because it did not disappear. It was there, stretching on, creeping into every moment, making everything feel unfamiliar. And in that silence she began to realize that she had not only lost a husband, but lost the person who had accompanied her in every decision, the person she always looked to before moving forward, the person she always believed would know what to do when she did not know. And when that person was gone, even the simplest choices became heavy, because she no longer had a point of reference, no longer had a familiar voice to confirm that she was going in the right direction, and that created a feeling of being lost that she had never experienced before. Not a momentary confusion, but a prolonged state, where every step lacked the certainty she once had. She tried to continue, tried to maintain life, take care of the children, appear in public. But behind all that was an emptiness that could not be filled, a feeling that everything was happening but no longer had the same meaning as before, because the person she wanted to share all those things with was no longer there to listen. And over time, that empty feeling did not lessen. It only changed shape, became more familiar but no lighter. She learned to live with it, the way she once learned to live with previous wounds. But this time, the loss was too great to be set aside. It became a part of daily life, appearing in unexpected moments, in old memories, in songs once tied to him, and each time like that, she had to face the reality that there were things that could not come back. And when the future had once been built around one person, losing that person was not just losing a relationship, but losing direction as well. She was no longer sure where she was going. No longer sure what was most important, no longer had a clear plan for the years ahead because all previous plans had him in them, and now that he was gone, she had to learn to rewrite her life from the beginning, not like an artist restarting a career, but like a person trying to find meaning again in a world that had completely changed, where everything still existed, still functioned, but no longer felt the same. And in that prolonged silence, that there were losses that could not be overcome in the ordinary way. They did not disappear with time. They only became a part of you. And you had to learn to live with them, even if that meant moving forward without knowing clearly where you were heading. After the long silence that seemed to have no end, Céline Dion decided to return to the stage, not because she was ready, but because she did not know what else to do except continue. The lights turned on again, the orchestra rose again, and thousands of audience members stood there waiting for the voice that had once saved them. But this time, each step she took onto the stage felt heavier. Each smile required more effort, and each note carried a part of the memory she could not separate. She stood under the lights with the familiar image, her hair prepared perfectly, her outfit chosen carefully, her eyes warm enough to reassure others, and her voice still rang out powerfully as if nothing had changed. But behind it all, there were moments no one saw, the minutes standing in the shadows before stepping out onto the stage, where she had to take a deep breath to keep her body from shaking, where she had to remind herself that she could still do this even though inside she was breaking apart piece by piece. The times when the door closed behind her, when the applause faded, she returned to a quiet space where she did not need to perform. And right there, the weakness appeared most clearly, not in big tears or strong reactions, but in silent fatigue. An empty gaze, a moment of sitting down without knowing what to do next, because the person she used to turn to after every show, the person she used to share every smallest detail with, was no longer there. And that made every success feel different, no longer complete, no longer meaningful as before. Even though the world still saw a strong woman, continuing to stand firm after loss, inside she still carried a loneliness that could not be easily shared. Because how could she describe the feeling of losing a part of the life she had lived with for decades? How could she speak of the emptiness when everyone around only saw the light? And that was why she continued to keep everything inside, the way she had done since she was little, the way she had learned to exist in a world that did not always listen. And life continued to move on. The performances followed one another, the trips, the schedules, the interviews. Everything still happened in the familiar rhythm. But the feeling inside had changed, no longer the excitement, no longer the full joy, but a necessary continuation, as if she was keeping everything from collapsing rather than truly enjoying it. And in those rare moments when she was alone, when there were no lights, no audience, no expectations, she clearly felt the gap between her current life and her previous life, a gap that could not be filled by time or work, because what had been lost was not something that could be replaced, and even though she still moved forward, still stood firm, still sang, still smiled deep inside, she knew that life had changed in a way that could not go back, that the person she once was no longer existed fully, and what remained was a version learning to live on, not with certainty, but with persistence, day by day, step by step, keeping herself from collapsing, even when no one really saw the battle happening inside. But even when Céline Dion tried to keep everything running as before, something else was quietly happening inside her body. Not loudly, not easy to notice right from the start. Just small signs that she initially tried to ignore, sudden muscle spasms. Moments when her body did not respond as quickly as before, times standing on stage when she felt she was not fully in control of her own movements. And then those signs did not disappear, they came back, more frequently, more clearly, until she could no longer convince herself that it was just ordinary fatigue. And when the doctors finally gave the diagnosis of stiff person syndrome, a rare disease that directly affects the nervous system and muscles, everything seemed to fall into another kind of silence. Not the silence of loss, but the silence of realizing that this battle was unlike anything she had faced before, because this time, the problem was not in circumstances, not in others, but right inside her own body. The thing she had trusted absolutely for decades of performing, the symptoms did not stop at discomfort, they directly affected the ability to stand firm, to move, and most importantly, the ability to sing, because each note required not only emotion, but also perfect coordination of the body, and when the body no longer responded as before, everything became uncertain. Pains appeared without pattern, moments when muscle spasms made her almost unable to move normally. There were days when even standing straight became a challenge, and in those moments, she was no longer the woman who once controlled the stage with absolute precision, but a person trying to keep balance within her own body. And the pain was not only in the physical sensation, but in realizing that the things that defined who she was were gradually being threatened. Each training session became harder. Each performance became unpredictable. And finally, the decisions she had always tried to postpone also had to be made. Tours were cancelled, plans were put on hold, announcements were sent out not just as information, but as an admission that she could no longer continue as before. And for a person who had lived her whole life on stage, having to stop was not just a change in work, but a change in the entire way she existed. Life began to shrink. No more constant trips, no more dense schedules. Instead, there were treatment sessions, forced rest periods, limits she had to learn to accept even though she did not want to. And in that change, she had to face a difficult truth that there were things that could not be controlled by willpower, could not be overcome by effort alone. That there were limits that no matter how strong she was, she could not break. And that very thing made this journey different. Because this was no longer a story about trying harder to achieve something, but a story about learning to live within new limits, learning to adjust expectations, learning to find a new rhythm of life not based on what she once knew. And in that process, she not only had to face physical pain, but also a profound sense of loss, because each passing day was a reminder that her body was no longer the companion it once was, but had become a reality she had to adapt to, even if that meant letting go of the things that had once been the center of her life. And then, when the limits of her body became increasingly clear, Céline Dion began to face a fear deeper than any physical pain. That was the fear that her voice, the thing that had defined her entire being, was no longer stable as before, no longer the tool she could trust absolutely every time she stepped onto the stage. There were days she tried to raise her voice, but felt the sound no longer rang out in the familiar way. There were moments when her breath was no longer as controlled as before, and the notes that once came easily now became challenges, not because she forgot how to sing, but because her body no longer responded as before. And that created a painful gap between the person she once was and the person she was becoming. Because throughout her life, she had never separated herself from her voice, had never thought she would exist as anyone other than a singer. And when the ability to maintain her form began to decline, not in a clear straight line but in unpredictable fluctuations, sometimes good, sometimes not, sometimes strong, sometimes weakening, that made everything unstable, no longer the certainty she once relied on. And in an industry where perfection was expected, where audiences remembered you for what you could do at your highest level, the inability to maintain that level was not just a technical change, but a threat to her position, to the way the world perceived her. And right there's another worry began to form, the worry of being forgotten, not immediately, Not waking up one day and everyone forgetting her, but a slow process where new generations appeared, new voices gained attention, and her image gradually became more memory than present. And for a person who had lived her whole life in the spotlight, becoming a memory was not easy to accept, not because she craved attention, but because her presence had always been tied to being heard, being felt, being connected, and when that ability was threatened, she was not only losing her place in the industry, but losing the only way she knew to connect with the world. And in the moments of facing that, she began to realize the growing gap between the past and the present. The past, where she stood on stage with absolute confidence, where each note was a natural part of who she was, where she did not need to think about whether she could do it or not. And the present, where everything needed to be considered, where each movement had to be cautious, where each time she raised her voice came with the anxiety of whether it would still be like before. And that gap was not only about time, but about feeling, about identity, about the fact that she no longer recognized herself the way she once did. And this did not happen in a single moment, but accumulated through each day, each experience, each realization that things she once took for granted were no longer there. And that very accumulation made the feeling of loss deeper, because she was not only losing an ability, but losing a part of herself, a part that had accompanied her since she was a little girl standing in that crowded house, singing to be heard. And now, when that ability was no longer certain, she had to face a question she had never had to ask before. That if there was no longer her voice, who would she be? And that question had no easy answer. No replacement role, no clear path, only an empty space she had to learn to step into, step by step, even without knowing what she would find on the other side. And then came a point when Céline Dion could no longer keep everything inside as before, not because she wanted to change the way she appeared to the world, but because the truth had become too clear to hide when she first spoke openly and honestly about her health condition, not through short statements or vague explanations, but with rare sincerity, admitting that her body no longer worked as before, that the muscle spasms, the limitations in movement, the difficulties in controlling her voice were not temporary, but a part of the reality she had to face every day. And in those shares, there was no longer the arranged perfection, no longer the image of a diva always in control of everything, but a person trying to say what she had kept inside for too long. Admitting her own limits was not easy for someone who had lived her whole life based on overcoming every limit. But this time, she understood that not every battle could be won, not every challenge could be overcome by willpower alone, and that very acceptance became an important step, not surrender, but a form of honesty she had never allowed herself before. She no longer tried to hide her emotions, no longer tried to keep everything looking stable when inside it was not. And in that process, she began to look back at her life not only through achievements, but through the losses that had shaped who she was, from a childhood lacking being heard, to the relationship that had become the center of everything, to losing the person she never thought she would have to live without, and now facing a body that no longer belonged to her as before. All those things were no longer separate parts, but connected into a journey she began to understand more clearly, not to find answers, but to accept that there were things that did not need to be explained to exist, and when she spoke about what she was going through, not as a complaint, but as a simple truth, that did not make her appear weaker in the eyes of those who understood, but instead made her image closer, more real, because for the first time, the world did not just see a voice, but saw a person living with limits, with fears, with memories that could not be erased, and in that acceptance, she did not find immediate relief. There was no clear sense of release, but was a change, a different quietness, not the silence of loss, but the silence of no longer having to hide anything. A state where she could exist without needing to maintain a perfect image, without needing to prove anything, just to be present in her own reality, even if that reality was not like what she once knew. And in accepting reality, she did not erase the past, did not try to become the person she was before, but learned to live with everything that had happened, as an inseparable part of herself. And perhaps, in that journey, what she revealed was not only her health condition or her limits, but a truth that many people had felt for a long time but had never heard her say, that behind everything the world saw, she had never really been immune to pain. She had only learned to carry it with her, day by day, step by step, until there was no longer any reason to hide it anymore. And when everything has been said, when there is nothing left to hide, Céline Dion begins to look back at her entire journey not as a story of success, but as a series of moments interwoven between light and shadow, where every step forward is accompanied by something left behind. From the little girl who grew up in a crowded house where music rang out nonstop, but personal emotions could easily be drowned out, to the woman who gave her whole heart to one single relationship, building her entire life around one person she believed would always be there. Then to the phase where the world began to call her name, when her voice was not just sound but became the memory of millions of people. All of those things do not exist separately but are connected to each other, forming a path she has walked. A path that not only has peaks but also segments where she had to walk in the dark without knowing when the light would return. And in that journey, success and loss are never separate. They always exist in parallel, like two sides of the same reality. When she achieved what many people dream of, she also had to face things no one wants to go through. Losing the person she never thought she would have to live without, losing the certainty she once had in her own body, and gradually losing the image she had built over many years. But what keeps her story from stopping at those losses is that she still continues, not with the strength the world often praises, but with a form of quiet perseverance, where each passing day is a choice to keep existing, not because everything has become easier, but because she has learned to live with what cannot be changed. Her current life no longer revolves around tours or dazzling stages, but around family, the children she waited for and protected with everything she had. Mornings that are no longer rushed, days no longer divided by a dense schedule, but filled with simple moments, conversations, meals, time she rarely had before. And in that change, her pace of life has slowed down, not because she wants to stop completely, but because she understands that there are things more important than continuing to chase what once defined her. She no longer measures life by the number of performances or the number of audiences, but by smaller things, the moments when she can be present without having to become anyone other than herself. And even if her voice may not be like before, even if her body no longer allows her to do what she once did naturally, she is still there, still existing, not as an untouchable icon, but as a person who has been through so much and still chooses to keep going. And perhaps right there, her image becomes different, no longer a legend defined only by what she has achieved, but a human being defined by the way she faces what she has lost, not completely healed, not having found a clear answer to every question, but that she is still here, still breathing, still living in an imperfect reality. And that, in some way, becomes a different kind of strength, not loud, not needing to prove anything, just simply existing, and continuing, even when everything has changed to the point she no longer recognizes herself as before. Because sometimes the greatest thing a person can do is not to overcome everything, but to keep living when nothing is certain. And in that continuation, her story does not end with a clear victory, but with a quieter image. A woman standing between what has passed and what remains. Not perfect, not complete, but still there, still breathing, still carrying everything that has shaped her as an inseparable part of her life. The story of Céline Dion does not move people only because of the losses she has gone through, but because of the way those losses happened quietly, prolonged, and almost without a clear ending. From a child who grew up in a crowded family but was not really listened to a woman who put her whole life into Renée Angelil, then had to watch him weaken day by day in the hospital before he was completely gone, and then continued to face stiff person syndrome that made her own body betray the voice that made her famous. All those details do not stand alone but are linked together, showing a life where success has never been separated from the price to pay. The sad thing is not that she lost everything, but that she had to learn to keep living when the most important things disappeared one by one. And that is exactly what makes her image more worthy of respect than any title. Because she does not represent perfection, but represents the ability to endure and continue to exist in imperfect conditions. And for the American people, where the culture often honors success, strength, and the ability to control life, this story is a reminder that not everything can be solved by effort or willpower, that there are periods in life where the only thing we can do is not to win, but not to collapse. The lesson is not in becoming a better version, but in accepting that there are times when we are no longer as before, but can still continue to live meaningfully. Like the way she returned to the stage after losing her husband, even though inside she was still broken, or the way she stopped when her body no longer allowed but still kept her dignity and honesty with herself. That is a form of strength that is not always ancient, but is something anyone needs when life does not go the way they expect. If Céline Dion's story makes you think, please hit subscribe and leave a small sign to honor a person who still continues to live even after losing so much. Thank you for listening until the end, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore the stories behind the spotlight that not everyone sees.